When you have a multi-generational workforce, you can't for one moment expect that every generation is going to come in with the same values, the same preferences, the same ways they want to communicate. So we have to actually be intentional and strategic about how we help these teams form. The point of GenShift is to give companies, organizations, even sometimes families, to help people understand why this tension across the generations feels so real right now, and then to give practical ways that we can work through it.
We are ready to get started. So excited that you are all here to hear from our amazing speaker, Dr. Katherine Jeffery. Dr. Jeffery is a generational researcher and practitioner who's passionate about guiding companies and organizations through the massive leadership transitions in the world right now. Okay, so y'all, I'm gonna take a pause right here. Who else is feeling these massive workplace transitions right now in so many capacities? I know I'm feeling it, so maybe y'all can affirm me and feel like, yeah, we're friends here. We are feeling it right now, and I feel like this is the perfect time for us to talk to Dr. Jeffery, who is a highly sought after consultant and presenter. She is well known for her engaging workshops on intergenerational dynamics. When we're talking about how companies worldwide can rely on a person's expertise in learning more about how they can bridge the gap between what they want, right? Like where they're at and what they want to get to, right? We're talking about fostering collaboration, implementing effective leadership practices. Dr. Jeffries is here to translate that research into practical solutions for us. And she's made her international thought leadership work shape the future of leadership and organizational development for organizations all over the world. So with that, I welcome to the virtual Zoom stage, welcome Dr. Jeffery. Katherine, we're so excited you're here.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Yeah, so tell us a little bit about GenShift. What is GenShift? Lay the foundation for us. What are we doing? How did you get to this point where you created this concept of GenShift?
Yeah, so really the point of GenShift is to give companies, organizations, even sometimes families, whenever I get done speaking, people are like, that not only helped me with my colleagues, it helped me with my kids, but to help people understand why this tension across the generations feels so real right now, and then to give practical ways that we can work through it. Because I think everybody, no matter what generation they're from, they want to get along. They want to collaborate well together. They want to have strong, positive outcomes. And so we're trying to do our best to equip people to do that. And if you look at this slide, this is the first time in history that there are 5 generations represented in the workforce. That has never happened before. And our traditionalists are down to about 2% of our workforce. But if you think about healthcare, law firms, insurance, right, they're still out there. They're still productive members of our teams. And, if you stop for just a second and you think about the world that a traditionalist grew up in, right, many of them did not have indoor plumbing. Now, if you stop for a second, think about the world a Gen Zer has grown up in, right? They've never known a world without the internet. So those are 2 very different worlds. And if all we were going to do today was talk about communication across the generations, right? Communication has evolved so much across the span of these generations that there's this huge gap. And one of the things I want everybody to just be thinking about is when you have a multi-generational workforce, you can't for one moment expect that every generation is going to come in with the same values, the same preferences, the same ways they want to communicate, right? No, we're all operating out of these different paradigms. And so we have to actually be intentional and strategic about how we help these teams form, because it's not just magically, organically going to happen. So that's a big part of why we did GenShift.
Yeah, I love that. So I love how you explained the traditionalists. I mean, you kind of mentioned that they didn't have indoor plumbing. I'm like, wow, they're probably still using lard. I don't know. I've seen all those funny memes about the traditionalists, right? And so can you just walk us through each of those generations, right? So we're talking about these 5 generations in the workplace right now. This is the first time in history that this has happened. So talk us through these five and name them for us.
Yeah, so there's the traditionalists. As I said, they're down to about 2% of our workforce. They, there was a war going on as they were coming of age, right? That really shaped them and shaped the way they think about leadership. Then you have the boomers, right? They had civil rights, Vietnam, hippies. Those were some of the things happening in their world. Gen X, we were the generation known as the latchkey kid, right? We had to come home and let ourselves in, and we had the space shuttle, the Challenger exploded with the first teacher, right, to ever go into space. And that really for us, I always joke about most Gen Xers remember watching that on a TV. It was sitting on a library cart, right? Teachers really mattered to us at that point. And then this teacher, we watched her die. And what they did for Gen X, right? They turned off the TV. We all went back to math class. It's the suck it up, get over it, get through it mentality. And that's kind of how Gen X has learned to live. And then there's the millennials, right? They had 9/11, and which was very traumatic for them and it really shaped them. And they're known as the collaboration generation and also the trophy generation. And then you've got your Gen Zers who've experienced school shootings. COVID will be a huge demarcation for them. And they're very proud about being part of Gen Z, and bring a lot of energy and innovation into the workplace.
Love it, love it, love it. And I really don't, I feel like my kids are Gen Zers, or maybe they're the Gen, is it Alpha now? Gen Alpha?
Yes.
There's like
And
a whole thing happening, right, with Gen Alphas. Yeah.
yes, the next generation is Gen Alpha, and then 2025 is the first year for Gen Beta.
Oh my goodness. Okay. So there's so much happening. So we crafted this session today to be a fireside chat so we can get into the details of what this really means. And the reason I wanted to do this fireside chat was because this doesn't just have implications in our workplaces, it has implications across our lives, right? People are living longer. So we are living our lives with multiple generations in our families, in our communities, right? So how can we have stronger relationships? How can we resonate better with the people that we love or people that we want to resonate with or people that we want to bring into our circles? But more important than that, how can we have impact in the work that we're doing? So, Dr. Jeffery, I definitely want to have a really candid conversation with you and my friends who are here joining us on this session today. So, I want to kind of ask you to set the stage for us. What's this big generational shift that we're talking about? You have called it Gen Shift, but I feel like it's happened overnight, right? Is this something that people are talking about? Are they not talking about it? Tell us about that.
Yeah, I mean, this is happening around the world and every sector of our workforce and even families are feeling this, right? It's very real. And a lot of it has to do with technology and how quickly that's changing and how there's the gap is getting larger and larger. In fact, the hugest technology gap across the generations is between Gen X parents and their Gen Z children, right? The change. And so we have to work really hard to keep up and adapt and remain flexible. And if we're talking about the workplace, the traditionalists actually built many of the organizations that currently exist, right? Then the boomers came in, they shaped the values and beliefs in these organizations. Then Gen X came in, we create a lot of the systems, how are things going to flow within that organization? And then we actually are the first generation to start pushing for workplace flexibility, right? We wanted more room to move. But Gen X, there's only 60 million Gen Xers. There's over 80 million boomers, over 80 million millennials. So while we tried really hard to create change, overall, we ended up joining the status quo. And we all learned what the rules of the world of work were. And then we learned how to play by those rules. And so what we have in many organizations is a literal status quo that has existed for more than half a century. Right? This is the way we do it here. You all need to get on board. Well, then millennials and Gen Zs come in highly influenced by technology, obviously, and the way that they think about things, the way they communicate has evolved. And so the workplace has to evolve with it. And that's taken time and a lot of energy because it's tough when you've done your whole career one way And now the world's telling you it's going in this way, and you've got to adapt and evolve along with it.
Hmm. And I think the key word here was what you said at the end, which was adaptation, right? We have to adapt and move with the times, right? This is where we're at right now. And so you did kind of lay the foundation for us in terms of, which generations are working side by side, maybe what the team dynamics are. When I think about boomers, right? People who are born before the internet, right? I think about people who prefer to call you versus texting, right? They're like, they're blowing up your
Yes.
phone, right? So I feel like, there's a language here to learn. Like that generational shift, this gen shift is a new language people need to learn. I know we're in the AI era now. Everyone's like, learn how to AI prompt, right? But there is something that's gonna stand the test of time, which is learning how to talk with generations, right? Learning how to communicate effectively, right? So I want to ask you, we're thinking about this pretty diverse group of people that work together. There's so many different ways that everybody likes to communicate with each other. And I just imagine that there's certain parts of the work that get away from being more complicated, and people sort of see it as like, this is how my boss prefers things to be done, right? Versus the transition of, should the boss be the one who adapts themselves to how the team prefers things to be done, right? And so I want to ask you, where do these generational differences cause the biggest drama at work? I'm thinking of technology use, communication. There's so many things going through my mind, but I just keep thinking about how we're asked to, show up the way your boss wants you to show up, right? Like, this is how your boss wants you to show up. But like, is there something to be said about understanding how we have to show up for each other?
Yes, I love that. And I think one of the things that's essential to keep in the front of your mind when you're dealing across the generation, the generational divide, is to understand that, sometimes I talk about the generations as if they're different cultures, right? So if I'm going to a country or culture I've never been to before, I'm going to take time to learn about them. I want to know what made them who they are, what formed them. I might learn some of their language, right? I'm going to learn customs and values that are important to them. And I think when you apply that to the generations, so even if we grew up in the same country, the world that we were formed in was so different. And so it really is a different culture. And I think what we have to understand is that we're actually operating out of different paradigms from different generations. And what happens is, instead of being curious and seeking to understand someone across that generational divide, what we end up doing in our heads and sometimes out of our mouths is we make it good versus bad or right versus wrong, when neither person is right or wrong or good or bad. It's that they have a different paradigm that they've learned and that they've continued to apply. Right. And so that's where I think the heart of where we can really get into trouble. Now, where that shows itself is, like you said, around communication. And you even nailed one of those, right? Is, millennials will tell you, like, please don't call me out of the blue. Right. If you call a millennial out of the blue, typically they're going to think that someone has died, and it feels very urgent. And they would much rather have you send them a text that says, hey, are you available? Can you chat? Can I catch up with you in 5 minutes? They want some warning because they're doing their thing. And then your Gen Zers would add to that. They would say, not only do I want you to ask for, if I'm available, but also tell me why you want to talk to me, because then I can come into the conversation prepared and ready to go. Right. So that can be a huge one. Um, Another one is that people get a kick out of is, when you're texting a Gen Zer, oftentimes older generations, we put periods in our text messages because it's good grammar, it's good punctuation, right? But to younger generations, that period can feel very aggressive, very harsh, very mean, right? And older generations are like, what do you mean? I'm not mad at you. It's just a period. But to younger generations, that period has a different meaning because a text message for them is very casual conversation, right? And even this, if you send this emoji to somebody, right? For older generations, it always often means good job, way to go, okay. And for younger generations, this has become very passive aggressive and even sarcastic. It's kind of like they don't appreciate that, right? So we can really And what happens, again, nobody's trying to upset somebody else, right? That is not what the intention behind it is. But because we're literally speaking a different language, that tension really starts to build. And if we never stop to talk about our different paradigms and try to make space for other people's paradigms, then the teamwork is really hard to achieve.
It is. You literally described chaos to me. Like, if let's just imagine I wasn't in the workplace and I didn't know that this actually happens, but you're describing something to me that just feels like somebody wants email, the other person wants a Slack message, the other person just wants to hop on a Zoom huddle real quick, right? It just sounds like super chaotic, right? So, I just want to ask you in terms of thinking through, you know, how do we go from here, right? Before we get too deep into thinking about the different generations, is there something that that we have to understand about ourselves, right? The way we approach work, because I think sometimes it's difficult if we are leaning in one direction, right? Like I may prefer one thing and that's my go-to, but then does that mean that I let go of what I'm used to so that I can be for somebody else, right? So then I start living in this world about who am I, right? I'm not really living my truth. What does that look like for an individual, right? How do they show up as their authentic self in these generations?
Yeah, I love that question. So you really, I think it's important for everybody from every generation to sit down and think about what your paradigm is, right? Like, so in terms of recognition, I'm a Gen Xer. How do I prefer to be recognized at work? Okay. And then once you understand your paradigm, sit down with your team and say to your Gen Zer, what matters to you? Right. And then, and both of you have that conversation, understand where you're both coming from, and then how can you meet in the middle? And if you can't, then, where do you negotiate that, and how does that look like, or what does that look like? Because if you never have the conversation, again, you've got all this tension underneath the surface because people are missing each other. But if you seek to understand and be curious, then that changes the entire dynamic.
I love that. I had that happen to me actually. I did have one of my coworkers. I had somebody I was leading on a team, and they mentioned to me that my style of the things that I preferred, which is put it on my calendar, let's talk about it, like send me a Slack, whatever, right? And they were mentioning to me how that wasn't helpful to them because they're in the flow, right? And I kind of felt like, oh, I didn't realize that, you know? So I feel like maybe we just need to communicate with each other, create the space so that people are able to communicate with each other. And I really love how you were digging into the fact that, like we do see the patterns and how people like to be communicated to. But I want to ask you in terms of this work of this gen shift, right? I think it's very, it's like, it's good work, you're doing really, really good work for us because, we have people in our lives that we have to communicate to, and they're in a different generation than we are in, right? And so I'm just thinking through, how did you get into this work? Like, did something happen? Did you have a millennial boss maybe, and things happened and they just kind of like made you rethink your experience in your work? How did you get into this work, Dr. Jeffrey?
Thank you for asking me that. So I did not intend to get into this work. I didn't know I was going to land here, but I love that I did. So I used to teach leadership development at a university for 10 years. And so I'm an Xer again, and this is when millennials were in college. So every year I would ask my students, what is the best form of leadership? And I gave them three choices: authoritative, democratic, or laissez-faire. And one year, they all raised their hand at laissez-faire leadership. And being the solid Gen Xer that I am, I was like, really? You all think you do you leadership is the best way to lead? And they were like, yes. And I was standing there going, wow, here I am trying to teach effective leadership to a generation who sees it through a completely different lens than I do. So I decided to do a huge qualitative study on millennials to try to figure out, like, where did this shift come from? How did we get here? And how can we understand this? And what do we need to do to move through this together? And then I started to realize, whoa, I'm not the only one that wants to understand this, right? Like, we're all trying to figure this out. And it's really important if we're going to have successful teams, right? It really matters.
It does really matter. And thank you for doing that research for us, by the way. And I feel like I've had the privilege of experiencing your courses and the information that you've been able to share, and I think it's been impactful for me. I do want to bring some amazing people into the chat, from the chat into the session today. We've been talking about how Katie says, how many times I have to ask my 12-year-old what a certain word or emoji means is crazy, right? When you think about the fact that we have to kind of communicate in a whole different way, and you've done the research on this, you've kind of figured out, how life experiences show up differently. But we're talking about work specifically, right? I'm thinking boomers, you talked about them, not having indoor plumbing. I'm thinking they were with typewriters, landlines. I mean, do
Oh
Gen Zers even know what a landline is? Do they even know what that is, right? And
yeah.
so in my mind, I just keep thinking to myself, right, that it's so wild that we're all supposed to be working together, and we talk about all these differences in terms of race, gender, and all the different things we can consider. But this generational shift is something that cannot be denied, right? And there's so much to talk about. One of the things that I have had the privilege of being a part of is our Coastal Bend Indigenous people population, which is really centered on learning more about Indigenous practices and how the life of Native Americans and First Nations people lived their lives. And they live through this lens of honoring and celebrating the differences in generations. It's sort of like just a natural lesson that's taught from the very beginning. And so I want to ask you, this care and concern for generations, why should we care? Is there a space where people may think, well, boomers, you're causing miscommunication and frustration and you're slowing it down, right? So like you're out, right? So but is there a benefit? How do we fix that? How do we gain success, right? How do we use these when we think about wisdom, ancient wisdom, right, from how we lived in multiple generations in the past? How do we fix this in our workplaces so that we can move from tension to teamwork?
Yeah, I would say there's never been a time in history where it's more important to hear every generation's perspective. Like we're all in this huge technological shift that's occurring. And, millennials and Zers can't do it without the experience of boomers and Xers, and boomers and Xers can't do it without the innovation and new ideas that the millennials and Zers bring, right? And it used to be, if I have an issue in life or there's a stumbling block for me, I'm going to go to my grandparents because they've been there, done that. They've taught me, they can teach me something to get through to the other side. Well, now if I'm going to stay relevant, I am not going to my grandparents, right? I'm going to go to my Gen Zers. And so we have to have that conversation coming in from every direction. And I think it's not just about, older generations adapting to new generations. I think it's new generations also working to understand older generations, because to your point, you don't want to lose what they have brought. And it brings so much knowledge and wisdom into the present.
There's so much. Everything you say, I just feel like digging into like every little tidbit of everything you're saying, because this miscommunication for me is such a big deal, especially when we have now Gen Alpha who is moving into internships, right? Like they're actually going to be in our workforces as well, right? So it's about what you're saying is it's about, if you want to stay relevant, if you want to have better collaboration and continue to have fresh ideas, it's about really understanding who you're communicating to in your future, right?
Yeah.
That's what I heard you say. But I want to talk a little bit about how we can get there. So let's talk strategy. And you have had the privilege of working with our friend Joe Lesko in SunShower Learning. And you actually created this concept called GenShift, and you've created a process for people to learn how to work with different generations. So what makes it stand out, and why do you think that this, by the way, y'all, award-winning program, okay, this program has won multiple awards. How have you made this program successful, and why do you think it's important for today?
Oh, so easy to answer that. Like, first of all, we had so much fun making it. And I think that really comes across to the participants. Like, I think you're not just sitting there going, okay, when is this going to be over? Like, it's actually very interactive. It's engaging. It engages with the participant on many levels, right? And we hired actors to actually act out real life scenarios. And, I've had people say, oh my gosh, that just happened to me yesterday, And so it allows you to even talk through these scenarios and what would you do about this when this happens on your team, right? And then we have commentary, right? I'm talking throughout the whole thing saying, okay, think about this. Have you thought about this perspective? And I had a boomer who has taken the course, and he sent me an email the other day and he said, Katherine, you just saved a Gen Zer their job because it helped him understand the Zer's perspective and that it was okay, right? It was just different. And so it kind of took his nails out of the wall, right? He was able to calm down and actually move forward with this employee, which that's the kind of thing we get really excited about.
Yes, I love it. I get excited about that too. It sounds like you're really helping people break out of the old habits, right? So that we can work better together. I really love how it transitions very nicely from these real world scenarios where people are kind of playing out the roles, right? But also for me, it's less about the theory of the generations, but also about like the wow of this is an actual moment that actually happened yesterday. I cannot wait to like flex this new skill I just learned in this course. I want to talk a little bit about how we can think about the stereotypes. Now, this is kind of like talking about the challenges of the generations, because there is something to be said about people labeling you, right? People saying, oh, you're a boomer or you're a Gen Zer. The thing I hear about Gen Z is, did they even work today, right? Did they even show up to work, right? Like that's kind of like the funny thing that's said, but is it really funny, right? Is that something that's a label that's to recognize or stereotype people as being lazy? Can you talk a little bit about that? This labeling, what does it do in the workplace?
Yeah, well, it obviously can be very detrimental and it impacts your team in larger ways, I think, than people realize. And we all have that kind of generational bias, right? Every one of us on some level, if we're truly honest. And we've all said things like, gosh, you're such a millennial, or hashtag okay boomer, right? And we kind of laugh it off, but it actually impacts how people show up on our teams. And I always ask people, like, would you make those same kind of comments in any other area of diversity? Like in today's world of work, would you look at me and say, "Ugh, you're such a woman"? You wouldn't dare say that, but we don't hesitate to say it about an entire generation of millennials, right? And they're just so tired of it, right? And like I had one boomer CEO, and she used to come out into the foyer of her workplace pretty regularly, and she would say, "I need a millennial." And what she was really saying, but not saying, was, "I feel a little bit embarrassed. I need help with technology. Can one of you please come help me?" Right? So reluctantly, a millennial would get up, they'd go help her. And then she started to realize like she had these employees leaving and they were all millennials. And she's like, what's going on? Like, why are they all leaving? And one of them finally sat her down and they said, we bring a lot more value to your company than just our skills with technology, but that is the only thing you ever call us out for. So even by her simply trying to hide her own embarrassment, right, she was isolating an entire generation so much that they didn't want to work for her anymore. So this stuff really, really matters. And it's important. Like the things we allow ourselves to believe up here, they eventually make their ways out, right? Or make their way out. And it impacts our teams. And I would also encourage people, think about the people that you're promoting. And do they have really strong biases or stereotypes, right? What's the message they're communicating? Because if you're trying to create a really positive culture for every generation, that's obviously not going to help you accomplish that.
That's such a great point. And oh my gosh, I literally have an example of that, like just popped into my head. I had a director once who wouldn't promote somebody on my team because they felt like that person hadn't paid their dues. Like they were too new to the workforce. Like, how could they possibly need a promotion right now? And it's like, are you kidding? Like, this person's crushing it. Like, it doesn't matter if they've just gotten into the workforce or you feel like they have, and the conversation was about they haven't paid their dues. Like when I was coming up, right, as a boomer, like I had to work so hard to get here, like they need to pay their dues. So I feel like what you're really saying is that we can't box people into this understanding of where we are coming from, right? It's really about understanding where others are coming from as well. I want to give a shout out to Dr. Frank Gonzalez, who is joining us today. Dr. Frank is going to be on our future webinar with us. And Dr. Frank actually said style depends on the audience, right? So the way you flex your communication style or whatever it is, it depends on the audience, right? There's a season and a reason for it all. I love that. And then I also want to give a shout out to Sherry Collins. Sherry is actually an amazing presenter who talks about ageism, and I absolutely love following Sherry on LinkedIn. If you do not know who Sherry Collins is, go find Sherry Collins on LinkedIn. And Sherry Collins is all about eliminating that myth and stereotype of ageism, right? When we think about generations in the workplace, we are talking about age diversity. We are talking about how that is a concept that needs to be considered and needs to be put in the forefront and spoken about, right? It shouldn't be this thing that people are just kind of secretly saying, right? In the back rooms, like, oh, that's a millennial or that's a Gen Zer. We should be speaking about it boldly, right? So I want to ask you about this generational shift that's happening right now. There's a lot of companies that still don't have the right processes in place. What would you tell them? How would you transition a leader who does not have that concept of the generational work to being able to work with multiple generations in the workplace?
Yeah, I would say it is more than worth your investment, right? The Economist did an international study of CEOs, and they found that in North America, the number one reported diversity issue was actually age, right? And age discrimination lawsuits are at an all-time high, right? Older people feel it for obvious reasons. Younger people actually also feel it. I always tell people, I have millennials I work with who say, when I go to work, I dress like a Gen Xer and I talk like a Gen Xer, because I feel like if I tell them I'm a millennial, I'm not going to get my next promotion. Right. So it's really important that we're creating spaces where every generation can thrive. And less than 50% of companies actually think about age when they think about diversity, right? But it's an issue we're all experiencing. So even if you have budget constraints, right? This, like, actually just having generational awareness training can increase your productivity by 10%. Right. So it's not just about that initial upfront money, it's the long-term success that your employees are going to experience, because they're going to feel like they're more valued in the workplace. They're going to be able to engage and work better together, right? Those bridges are going to be built. And so I just think it's something that's going to pay you back in volume.
And that's so true. You know, there is this, sometimes people talk about having that culture fit, like they're hiring somebody, no matter the generation, if they fit with the team, if they're fitting in, right? But what are we looking for? If you want more innovation, if you want to optimize, you're looking for culture additions. And the only way to get there is by helping people not make assumptions or saying they'll just figure it out, right? Like you'll figure out how to work here or how to get that promotion that you're talking about, right? I really love how you said that. So for this last question, I kind of want to gear it towards millennials, maybe Gen Z folks, maybe a lot of us who may be thinking about higher leadership roles, right? I want to just ask you for some advice, right? When we're thinking about the fact that maybe the boomers are the ones who are making the decisions on who's getting promoted, who's going to step into the new leadership role. What's some advice that you can give for millennials, Gen Z folks? Tell us, what do we do?
Yes, I would say first be a student of older generations. Like seek to understand why they do what they do, right? So observe, listen, and learn. I have one millennial, this was a few years ago. They started to respond to emails the way their boomer boss responds to them. And that person, simply because they did that one thing, they shot up the ladder, right? Because all of a sudden they weren't put in this box and they were seen as someone who was willing to work with the team, right? Now, whether that's right or wrong, good or bad, it made a difference because they moved towards that older generation rather than saying, no, we're going to do it my way. I would also say, grow in your emotional intelligence, right? In today's world, it used to be if I'm your leader, you all have to adapt to me and my personality. Well, now in today's world, I have to understand each person on my team, and I need to be able to show that I care about them as individuals, right? And and bring out the specific and unique value that they're bringing to the team. And if I'm not able to understand myself and what I bring, I'm going to have a harder time understanding what other people bring, right? And it's not so much about me, it's about creating those relationships and building those bridges with the other people on my team. And then I would say, don't just think that because you have information in your hands that you're going to be able to work well with other generations and manage people, right? Be open to learning from people who have managed people before you, because managing people is often more of an art, right? Than something that you just do A to Z and you're a success, right? It's something that you have to build your intuition and it takes experience and time. And so tap into those resources, set up a mentoring relationship or a reverse mentoring relationship, right? Where you're both mentoring each other. I love that concept as well.
I love that too. You brought reverse mentoring into this. So this was a blast, me asking my questions that I have for you. So we're gonna kind of flip the script, and I'm going to go ahead and go ahead and go into the Q&A. As a member of Gen Z, I have a hard time feeling that my voice is heard. I often am not included or not listened to because of my age compared to my other colleagues, despite having the knowledge and qualifications to work and help. Yikes. Our recent engagement survey showed I'm not alone in Gen Z feeling like opinions aren't heard. Do you have any tips for how to help ensure our voices are heard on items that are important to us?
Such a good question. I recently did some focus groups for a company, and it was on under 35-year-olds, and they shared that same sentiment, right? And a lot of Gen Zers will say, like, hey, Catherine, the title is the ticket to the table, right? They feel like they have to be promoted before they're heard.
Mhm.
And so sometimes it's, again, getting into that mentoring relationship and even saying like, "Hey, I have some thoughts about this. How would you suggest? What's the most strategic way me to bring this up?" Right? And asking for opportunity, don't being afraid to use your voice, but also understanding that sometimes there's layers of politics around the way things move forward in an organization, and trying to understand that as well. Like, don't push so hard with your voice that people are like, "Whoa, what's that person doing?" So understand the nuances of your organization and how you can move forward and grow in your voice. And I think too, another thing I hear from older generations is that Gen Z, when they're trying to solve something, they keep asking questions, and older generations are like, "No, come to me with a solution." And so if your thoughts are solution oriented, that can actually go really far with older generations, because they're like, "Okay, you've thought about this. This actually has some merit to it, and so tell me more."
Mm-hmm. Yes, that solutions thing is such a big deal, right? And sometimes I think it may hold some people back from actually saying important things in a workplace because they may not have a solution, right? So there could be space there for bridging the gap, right? Like both people kind of need to meet each other where they're at. Matt asks, I think acknowledging generations can be helpful, but I also think it can lead to biased interactions. What recommendations do you have for both acknowledging that generations have similar lived experiences, but approaching each person as an individual?
Yes, I think we always have to approach each person as an individual, right? If we're going to work well or even build solid relationships with somebody. And I think of the generations, this whole topic, it's like one tool in your toolbox, right? And I think of it like this whole conversation, it's like we're looking through a filter or a lens that helps us understand that our world has changed over time, right? Therefore, people and the things they value and the ways that they communicate have also changed. So sometimes it's that tool in your toolbox you can pull out and go, okay, these two are missing the mark because they're just coming at it from completely different perspectives, right? And it can sometimes help us narrow down what's happening. But yeah, I agree. It'd be you can't lump every millennial, right, or every Gen
Mhm.
Xer into the same box, and we have to remember that, but it does give us some category to help us understand, right, like why they don't want to be called on the phone, they would prefer a text message,
Mhm.
right, that kind of
Yeah.
thing. So yeah.
That definitely makes sense. When yeah, I think it's just important to understand what people are coming from as an individual instead of putting them in a box, right?
Yes,
People don't want to be
absolutely.
put in boxes, right? Um,
Nobody wants that.
Nobody wants that. Do you have any tips on how to support and encourage Gen Zers through navigating entering the workforce as a parent?
As a parent, yes, I would say the more you can equip your Gen Zer to understand the world of work and how it operates, because if you ever follow a Zer around for a full day, the way they live their life is often very different than the way someone from an older generation does. And so they come into the workplace and they're like, why are you doing it that way? Why are you saying it that way? This doesn't make sense, right? And a lot of Gen Xers will actually tell me, like, Catherine, I feel like I'm parenting the Gen Zers on my team. And in some ways they are, because they're learning workplace culture. And so the more you can unpack that for them, like how to write an email, and if you have a Gen X client, how you need to respond more quickly, right, to that email, because Xers expect that, right? So how do we unpack that? And even things like, I tell this story all the time. I was working with a pizza company in Nevada, and all of the older managers at the pizza restaurants were really frustrated with the Gen Zers, because the Gen Zers didn't want to pick up the phone and take orders. Well, that is a huge issue when you run a pizza company, right? Well, let me ask you this. How many times has a Gen Zer ever answered the phone and not known who was on the other end of the line? Never. They've never done it. Okay. As a Gen Xer, the phone rang in my house. It could be my dad's boss, my mom's friend, my sister's boyfriend. I didn't know who it was, but I would answer the phone. I would talk to them for a minute or two, and I would, take a good message. Okay. That didn't stress me out. It didn't cause anxiety, right? It was just something I did almost every day. Well, Gen Zers have never done it. And it's not because they can't do it, they're very capable of it, but we assume they should just be able to do that and do it well. And so they have this apprenticeship mindset. And as a parent, you can do this so well, right? They want to study something, they want to practice it. They want to study it and practice it. So think about, what are those skills in whatever field they're going into that they might not have acquired simply because they've grown up in a different world? And how can you get them ready for those things where they just stand out, right, compared to their peers, because you have put in the time and effort to show them this other way?
Yes, you've opened their eyes to that there's multiple ways to show up, and you need to show up in this way if you're going to show up at work, right? And it kind of lands very nicely with our last question. How do we acknowledge the ideal, but also the reality? So just to set it up a little bit, Matt is mentioning that Matt feels like younger generations often feel like they've hit a wall in professional spaces because their personal ideal is different than, this is the way we do business, than the practice of the organization, right? So when we're thinking about how the ideal, right, the way the business wants things to be done versus how we believe, like, we could get things done 10 steps better if we did it this way, right? But we don't want to say anything because that's how it's always been done and that's my boss, right? How do we acknowledge the ideal but also the reality?
Awesome question. Okay, so I'm just gonna say context, context, context. Like, Gen Zers are coming in, right? They're entering the workforce. They don't always understand how this is gonna lead to this,
Mhm.
right? And so they need to have safe people. That's how they would talk about it. They need to have safe people around them where they can discuss how
Mhm.
they're feeling about something or what the context is. And if they don't have that, they're going to keep pushing for that ideal. But if they have someone who actually takes time, and again, I think this is where sometimes you feel like people feel like they're parenting them, but stepping back and saying, hey, if we don't hit this goal, or if you don't show up on time for work, or these things don't happen, then and we miss end goal by $1 million, then 10 people lose their jobs, right? Like they've got to understand how this one impact plays out long term. And we have to have the patience to help them get there.
I love that. Thank you so much. Context, 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 right? So always think about what's actually going on, right? Not just what you're seeing in front of you. Katherine, you have been such an incredible guest for us today. Y'all, can we get a thank you or a waterfall of thank yous or emojis?